Over the past few years, open world games have kind of fallen out of favor with me a little bit. Don't get me wrong, there are still some great sandbox style games out there, but for all the massive environments to explore and the countless hours of content most open world games have to offer, very few of them feel truly worthwhile. They're still good value for money, so long as you only care about the time that you can sink into them, but so often they just feel shallow. Ghost of Tsushima, however, feels like a cut above the rest, providing a reasonably large world that feels rewarding to explore while still providing fun and compelling core gameplay to back it all up. But let's start with Ghost of Tsushima's world, as it is easily the element of the game that caught me off guard the most. On a visual level, the island of Tsushima is vibrant and varied, with colourful forests, windswept grasslands, and snowy mountains to explore, and across all of these diverse landscapes there are constant particle effects that give the game a real sense of life. And these effects themselves are pretty varied too. Fireflies hang around certain trees, the air in each forest is full of falling leaves of the appropriate colour, and pollen or embers drift past you as you explore grassy plains or burnt-out villages respectively. These picturesque elements really come together thanks to Ghost of Tsushima's lighting, which looks absolutely stunning at various points during the day. I'm not a photo mode guy, but this game's visuals have definitely made me see the appeal of the feature. With that in mind, it isn't the gorgeous visuals of the world that helped the game leave a lasting impression on me, but rather the way it encourages you to explore it, without relying on you to continually open your map and set waypoints to find. This isn't to say that I never did that, because I did, and Ghost of Tsushima's use of a guiding wind as a waypoint is ingenious, as it allows players to look at the world and actually take it in, rather than simply keeping one eye glued to the bottom corner of the screen. A lot of the time, however, I found myself simply wandering between quests and collectibles naturally by following visual elements in the environment. Smoke plumes on the horizon would lead me to enemy strongholds or friendly campsites, while golden birds would often fly past me, leading to nearby things to do. Exploring in this manner feels like second nature. It's still guided to a degree, so folks without the natural curiosity to fuel exploration shouldn't feel lost or overwhelmed, but anyone looking to spend as little time staring at maps as possible should be pretty happy with the approach that Ghost of Tsushima has taken here. And for the folks out there who are keen to explore, there's a decent variety of things to find, most of which serve as bite-sized breaks from the main exploration, combat, and stealth, which we'll talk about a bit later. The most significant breaks that Tsushima offers are platforming sequences in the form of Inari and Shinto shrines. Inari shrines are these little monuments that are tucked away in secret spots that usually require a fox to lead you to them, while Shinto shrines serve as longer platforming sections where you need to climb ruined mountain paths to reach the top. Admittedly, neither type of shrine is particularly challenging to reach, as the game takes a fairly linear approach to climbing in most cases, and the focus is more on finding the path forward than actually executing well-timed jumps, though this does change a little bit with the inclusion of a grappling hook later on. Still, these feel worthwhile as they reward you with an excellent view of your surroundings as well as wearable charms that augment your abilities, and their relatively short length keeps them feeling unobtrusive. The game's side content also includes hot springs, haiku spots, and bamboo strikes to discover, and like the charms you gain by praying at the aforementioned shrines, each of these diversions rewards you for engaging with them as well. The hot springs and haiku spots are a little light on actual gameplay, serving instead as a look inside the thoughts of Jin, the protagonist, but you're rewarded with increased health and cosmetics respectively. Also, I just think it's kind of novel that the game lets you compose your own haiku by combining pre-written beginning, middle, and end lines on various topics. They aren't necessarily high art in their own right, but when was the last time poetry was a legitimate part of a AAA action game? Finally, the bamboo strikes are brief dexterity challenges that task you with hitting a progressively more complex sequence of buttons in a short amount of time. As with the rest of Ghost of Tsushima's side elements, these aren't super challenging or time-consuming. They really are a brief break from the core gameplay, but seeking them out and completing them feels worthwhile because you're always getting something out of the experience. Whether that be a stat improvement, a vanity object like a mask or sword kit, or a charm that can reinforce or change your playstyle entirely. None of this is to say that Ghost of Tsushima doesn't fall back on more tried and true open world fare though, as the game is still packed with enemy strongholds to clear and side stories of varying importance, but these rely much more heavily on the core pillars of Ghost of Tsushima's gameplay, its combat and stealth. Combat in Ghost of Tsushima generally focuses on group encounters, allowing you to take on multiple enemies at once with its intuitive offensive and defensive moves that start off fairly basic, but quickly grow in complexity. As your samurai journey begins, you have access to a block and a single offensive stance, but as you defeat enemy leaders and gain experience, you unlock a variety of stances that excel at dispatching certain enemy types, as well as expanded defensive options like perfect dodges and parries. Early fights do a fantastic job of teaching you the basics of light and heavy attacks, but the game gradually starts throwing new enemy types at you that encourage you to switch stances and use every tool in your arsenal, and ultimately, Ghost of Tsushima's combat feels very open and very satisfying as a result. Potentially the most satisfying element that Ghost of Tsushima's combat brings to the table is the standoff mechanic, which allows you to call out groups of enemies and duel their best warrior one-on-one to initiate a fight. These tense moments force you to watch your opponent closely while you hold your attack for the last possible second, releasing it as soon as your enemy goes in for the kill, and it is just the coolest thing. It also gets very tricky very quickly, as your opponents start trying to fake you out multiple times per duel, and their attacks get way faster in the late game, though this is balanced out somewhat by skills that let you clear entire patrols with a single successful standoff. On the subject of difficulty, Ghost of Tsushima's influx of new enemies and move types are mostly pretty manageable, but if you aren't paying attention, you can find yourself bleeding out in an instant. Thankfully, the game does have healing options in the form of Resolve. At any time you can push a button and use your Resolve to replenish a little bit of health, but it's not an infinite resource. Simply put, you will have to learn the game's combat properly because you regain Resolve by performing perfect parries and killing enemies. If you want to store up some heals, you better be ready to get good. Resolve can also be spent to pull off legendary special moves which make you feel like a total badass as you zip around the battlefield slicing and dicing your enemies with ease. They're a very satisfying get out of jail free card if you find yourself in a rough spot, but they aren't the only trick you have up your sleeve. You also gain access to ghost tools, which include various bombs and kunai, and these basically let you throw your enemies off balance to open them up for massive damage. These tools also play into Ghost of Tsushima's stealth gameplay as well, as your toolbox includes firecrackers and wind chimes to distract and isolate enemies from afar. On top of being easy enough to manipulate, the game's stealth systems are also pretty lenient, and if you know me, you know I like my stealth to be a little bit loose. That's not to say that ghosting your way through enemy encampments is always easy, but you are able to make a lot of mistakes without being punished too harshly. For instance, Ghost of Tsushima allows enemies to lose interest in you if you manage to escape their sightlines quickly enough, and for the most part, if you're on a rooftop or in some long grass, there's a good chance no one will bother you unless there's an archer, a hunting falcon, or a dog nearby. These stealth systems are capitalized on by the game's use of level designs that encourage plenty of freedom whenever you're trying to infiltrate a location, and just like the combat, the game gives you plenty of stealth upgrades as well, such as group assassinations. You can even take a ranged approach to either combat or stealth, but while the bows and blowpipe that you get are perfectly functional, they're easily the least interesting part of the game, for me at least. It is nice that Ghost of Tsushima gives you ammo types such as fire and explosive arrows, but I often found myself relying on the standard arrows during stealth and then neglecting all my other ranged options since, unlike the melee combat, there aren't a ton of reasons to use all of these options, unless you just like blowing dudes up, which I can respect. All in all though, the options that the game gives you are surprisingly vast, making for an experience that you can come at from almost any angle, and although the title of the game might suggest otherwise, Ghost of Tsushima is at its best when you're seamlessly transitioning between sneaky ninja and fearless samurai. Surprisingly, considering Sucker Punch and their previous games, Ghost of Tsushima doesn't feature any sort of morality system or multiple exclusive upgrade paths, and ultimately, I think this results in a much more complete gameplay experience as you're never locked into one gameplay style over another. I feel that this also helps the game deliver a much more consistent narrative, as much of Ghost of Tsushima's story focuses on the hero struggling with the rigidity of his code as a samurai in the face of an overwhelming enemy. You play as Jin Sakai, one of the last surviving samurai on the island of Tsushima following a disastrous battle against an invading force of Mongols. As these invaders wash over the island, Jin must make allies and learn more pragmatic and less honorable ways to combat the Mongol threat now that Tsushima has very few protectors left. It takes a little time to get any proper traction, but overall I really enjoyed the narrative of Ghost of Tsushima. Initially the characters are a little too stoic for my liking, and they all pale in comparison to the wildly charismatic villain Khotan Khan, but eventually I think the writing finds its footing when the focus shifts from the literal conflict between the Mongol invaders and Tsushima's defenders to the inner turmoil of the game's hero and his shifting code of morals. This personal struggle is helped along by an assortment of side stories involving Jin's supporting cast of allies, and though the specific subject varies between the characters in question, they all commit to the game's surprisingly tragic tone. Honestly, at times it can come off like Ghost of Tsushima might be taking itself too seriously, but the commitment to this dark tone through its quality performances and animations definitely won me over, especially during the game's latter half. In addition to Ghost of Tsushima's performances, its most memorable elements are reinforced by a presentation style that just screams samurai cinema. In addition to simply looking incredible, Ghost of Tsushima frames certain elements like standoffs and duels with cinema-style bars, making showdowns before these boss-style encounters look like an iconic samurai face-off from a movie, complete with wide-angle shots and this great build-up of tension. I would also be crazy to not mention the Ghost stance, which functions as something of a rage mode in combat but winds up looking way cooler thanks to the monochromatic filter and the black and red flourishes when you use it to kill an enemy. Across all of these moments in Ghost of Tsushima, the violent rampages of Ghost Stance, the tense showdowns amidst the island's lush scenery, or quiet exploration of the world's many nooks and crannies, the game's dynamic soundtrack is a constant and pleasant companion. It often utilizes a lot of string and woodwind elements in these soothing, flowing arrangements inspired by traditional Japanese music, but when you wade into a pitched battle, the percussion starts to kick in and it is super impactful. Hearing that score ramp up alongside the action is nothing new, but Ghost of Tsushima's score in particular does this so perfectly that I found it's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of the game's epic moments. Now, if you want to experience those epic moments and focus solely on the story, Ghost of Tsushima has about 15 or so hours of samurai cinema-inspired action to offer you, and it never feels like it drags or outstays its welcome. But this is an open-world game, and as I said at the top of this review, there is a sizable amount of bite-sized content to tackle across the island of Tsushima, and finding everything will effectively double that runtime. One of my few complaints about the game though is that it doesn't feature a New Game Plus mode, which is frustrating when you've collected everything and can't take your cosmetic items across to a new save file. I will probably be playing the game again though, since the game is just so much fun to play, and Sucker Punch have included full Japanese VO and a monochromatic Kurosawa film-inspired filter, which makes the prospect of a second run a little more tempting. With all that said, Ghost of Tsushima is excellent. If you've been paying attention, it should come as no surprise that I can't recommend Ghost of Tsushima highly enough. Its core mechanics are satisfying and fun, the game has really solid writing and interesting characters, and exploring the environment is a rewarding and refreshing experience thanks to its dynamic world and constant flow of, rewards. Ghost of Tsushima is a must-have for PS4 owners and a fitting swan song for the system. Ghost of Tsushima is out now for PlayStation 4.